My name is Elena Sterling. I am 32 years old, a heritage architect in a city that breathes on its reputation, and until yesterday, I was the invisible backbone of the most prestigious family in Charleston. The setting was designed to be perfect. Our ancestral estate was draped in velvet ribbons and white peonies, with 30 of the city's elite gathered to celebrate the Sterling legacy and my 32nd birthday. My mother, Victoria, stood at the center of the terrace, her cream silk dress catching the amber glow of the garden lanterns. She looked every bit the St. Charleston adored, raising her baccarat crystal glass with a smile that was practiced to perfection. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking, let's begin the story. But as the room fell silent for her toast, the warmth vanished. She didn't talk about my achievements or the years I spent restoring our family's honor. Instead, she looked me directly in the eye and told the room that I was nothing more than a regrettable mistake. She stated, with the clinical coldness of a woman reading a grocery list, that she had never loved me. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft clinking of ice in a glass across the room. I watched the recognition of her cruelty ripple through the guests, the frozen smiles of the women, and the stunned silence of my father's colleagues. I didn't crumble. I didn't let a single tear mar my reflection. I simply stood there, folded my silk napkin with steady hands, and realized that the cage door had finally swung wide. Victoria thought she was asserting her power, but she made one fatal error. She forgot that as an architect, I don't just build. I know exactly which load-bearing wall to pull to bring a corrupt structure down. What happened next wasn't just a birthday exit. It was the beginning of an invoice she was never prepared to pay. I walked toward my car, the sharp, steady rhythm of my heels on the pavement, sounding like a metronome counting down the seconds of my old life. As I sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the night felt different. It was no longer heavy with the exhausting expectation of being enough for my parents, but light with the sudden, cold realization of my own autonomy. My name is Elena Sterling, and for 32 years, I lived as the silent architect for a family that viewed my existence as a line item on a ledger rather than a daughter in a home. The woman back there, my mother Victoria, is a master of appearances, but she made one fatal error. She treated me like a building she could renovate or demolish at her whim, forgetting that I am the one who understands the true structural integrity of our entire legacy. The reason I didn't crumble when she declared her lack of love for me isn't that I am unfeeling. It is because I have spent years training myself to verify every detail twice. I had already seen the documents she thought were hidden. I had already calculated the real cost of her pride. What I am about to tell you is the story of how I stopped being a regrettable mistake and became the woman who handed the most powerful socialites in Charleston an invoice they couldn't afford to ignore. Before I take you back to the morning this all began to unravel, the day I discovered the first of many lies. I have a small request. If you've ever been the person in your family who was asked to sacrifice your own light so someone else could shine, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. I truly value knowing who is out there listening, so please, drop your city and your local time in the comments. Now, let me take you back 6 months into a quiet office on Broad Street, where I first learned that keeping the peace was just the Sterling family's way of ensuring my slow, deliberate disappearance. It started with a single signature that wasn't mine. To understand why my mother's public rejection felt like a mere structural crack rather than a total collapse, you have to understand the architecture of my upbringing. I grew up as the invisible child, the silent backbone of a dynasty that traded exclusively in appearances. While my brother Julian was heralded as the golden boy for every mediocre effort, I was the one in the basement, redrafting his failures into successes so the family name wouldn't tarnish. By the time I was 14, I wasn't just doing homework, I was auditing the family's structural reports and correcting Julian's design flaws so my parents wouldn't have to face the embarrassment of a failed heir. My father, Robert, saw my labor only as a duty, a quiet tax I paid for the privilege of being a sterling. Victoria was even more efficient. She consumed my talent and repackaged it as Julian's brilliance at every Charleston cocktail party, ensuring the spotlight never strayed from her favorite. My hands were rarely clean if they weren't stained with drafting ink. They were covered in the dust of the city's archives as I verified the history they claimed to own. I became a heritage architect, not out of ambition, but out of a desperate, ingrained need to keep things from falling apart for a family that never once thanked me for holding the ceiling up. I was the fixer, the one who worked 7-0-hour weeks in the shadows to ensure our name stayed on the bronze plaques of Broad Street, while my mother sat on charitable boards and took the public credit for overseeing the vision I had bled for. There is a specific kind of ache that lives in the hollow space between your ribs, right where a family is supposed to be, and for 32 years, I filled that void with work. The only person who looked past the ink stains and saw the daughter underneath was my grandmother, Lillian. She would sit with me on her porch on Trad Street and say, "Elena, they think you are the foundation, but they forget that the foundation is the only part that can survive when the rest of the house burns." She taught me that a house built on lies will eventually tilt, and she made sure I was the one who held the deed to the only honest structure left in our name. I was the daughter they ignored, because they couldn't afford to see me for who I truly was, the only thing keeping them from the table next to the trash can they so rightfully deserved. The elite contrast in Charleston is a grand performance where the script is written in fine calligraphy and the stage is lit by tens of thousands of dollars in venue decor. At the center of this theater stood my mother, Victoria Sterling, and my brother, Julian. Victoria wasn't just a socialite, she was the self-appointed architect of our family's public morality. She sat on multiple nonprofit boards and chaired the annual gala for the city's most prestigious foundations. To the public, she was a saint in cream silk, wearing pearl earrings, the size of dimes that shimmered as she spoke about sacrifice and legacy. But I saw the smile. That wasn't really a smile. It was a stiff, performative mask used to hide the growing rot in our family's finances. She inhabited a world where napkins were heavier than winter coats, and every social interaction was a calculated decision. Beside her was Julian, the golden boy whose only real talent was failing with immense style. He was given the title of managing acquisitions, but his only true acquisition was a trail of mounting debt and half-finished projects that I had to quietly salvage to protect the name. While Julian spent his afternoons at the country club, drinking aged scotch and laughing with developers who valued his name more than his competence, I was the one verifying his reports and fixing his structural blunders. He was the elite heir who always looked perfect, but he was merely a frame with nothing inside it. My mother adored him not because of his merit, but because he was a mirror for her own vanity, out of the frame. They were the powerful snobs of Charleston, their lives built on a foundation of information asymmetry. Julian was the polished facade, and Victoria was the curator of the lie. In their world, a working architect like me was just background noise, someone to be seated near the service entrance, so the important guests didn't have to look at the labor that made their lifestyle possible. They lived in a grand mansion on 2 acres, but it was a house of cards. And while they basked in the spotlight, they never noticed that the person they considered a regrettable mistake was the only one who actually knew where the structural weaknesses were hidden in the blueprints. The gradual encroachment began with what my mother called family unity, but I now recognize as a calculated campaign to harvest my identity for Julian's benefit. It wasn't a sudden heist. It was a series of small, polite thefts. When my restoration design for the historic customs house won a regional citation, Victoria didn't congratulate me. She simply instructed the printer to list Julian as the project lead on the Sterling firm's brochure. She told me it was a strategic move to vouch for Julian's reliability after his last 3 projects had stalled due to his incompetence. I was the talent, she argued, but Julian was the sterling face the city needed to see. Every time I pushed back, the atmosphere in the house turned arctic. My mother would tilt her head with that performative smile and say, "Elena, Don't be so precious about your name. Everything you do reflects on this family. My father, Robert, acted as the enabler who cemented this injustice. He would pull me aside in his study, the smell of old law books and expensive tobacco hanging in the air, and use his judge's voice to remind me of my duty. Your mother is just trying to manage the optics, Elena, he would say, his hand firm on my shoulder. He spoke of the sterling legacy as if it were a sacred trust that required my constant silence as a sacrifice. He told me to let Mom have this one, a phrase he had used to bury 1,000 of my grievances over the decades. I made what I thought was a calculated decision to lose these small battles, believing that if I gave ground on the credits and the brochures, I would win the war for my own independence later. I convinced myself that the labels didn't matter as long as I was doing the work, but I was wrong. These weren't just petty grievances, they were rehearsals for my total erasure. Victoria was testing how far she could push, gauging exactly how much of my dignity she could strip away before I finally made a scene. Every time I kept the peace to accommodate her vanity, I was unknowingly funding the construction of my own cage. I was the daughter who built the walls, and my mother was the woman who decided I didn't deserve a seat within them. The rehearsals for my erasure reached their final act on a humid Tuesday afternoon in a sterile office on Broad Street, away from the gaslighting glow of the sterling chandeliers. I had spent years accommodating the small thefts, but I wasn't prepared for the discovery of a total liquidation. I met with Marcus Thorne, an attorney who didn't speak in the flowery riddles of Charleston society but in the hard, unyielding language of probate and property law. He slid a black manila folder across his desk, a smoking gun that stripped away the last of my delusions. Inside were the mortgage documents for my grandmother Lillian's house on Trad Street, the only structure I truly owned, and the only place where I had ever felt safe. My breath hitched as I looked at the signature on the final page. It was my name, written in a script that mimicked my own with terrifying precision, yet I knew with every fiber of my being that I had never held the pen. Victoria had forged my signature on a power of attorney, POA, to leverage my inheritance as collateral for a $500,000 loan. The money hadn't gone toward preserving our heritage. It had been funneled into a private account to settle a disastrous, unrecorded debt Julian had incurred after a shrewd real estate acquisition turned into a legal nightmare. My mother didn't just want my talent. She had decided that my entire future was an expendable asset to be liquidated for the sake of the Golden Boy's reputation. Sitting in that quiet office, I realized the naked truth was far uglier than a seating chart or a stolen design credit. This was a calculated plan to ensure I would never have the financial means to leave Charleston. If Julian failed, I was the insurance policy. If Julian succeeded, I was the ghostwriter. The room seemed to tilt as the architecture of deception I had lived within finally revealed its true purpose. I wasn't just a regrettable mistake in my mother's eyes. I was a resource to be harvested until there was nothing left but the frame. I closed the folder, the weight of the paper feeling like a weapon in my hands, and I knew that keeping the peace was no longer an option. The sterling legacy was a house of cards built on my stolen signature, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the match. I took that folder home, the paper burning through the leather of my bag, like a secret that refused to stay buried. I didn't go to my mother first. I went to the one person I thought still held a shred of the justice he once dispensed from a bench. I found my father, Robert, in his study, surrounded by the heavy scent of mahogany and the thousands of law books that had defined his career. I laid the forgery on his desk, right next to his glass of bourbon, and waited for the man who had worn the judge's robes to finally deliver a verdict for his own daughter. I showed him the mortgage, the unauthorized lien on the only thing I had left of my grandmother, and the signature Victoria had stolen from me. I didn't shout. I used the clinical, factual tone I had learned from years of presenting structural reports. I was a daughter seeking a protector, but I was also an architect presenting the undeniable proof of a structural failure. He looked at the signature, my name in my mother's distinctive, elegant hand, and he didn't act surprised. He didn't gasp or offer comfort. Instead, he let out a long, defeated sigh, the kind a man makes when he is tired of pretending, but isn't ready to stop. Elena, he said, his voice flat and weary, we cannot have Julian in prison. We cannot have the Sterling name in the tabloids over a private family matter. He spoke of the $500,000 as if it were a minor inconvenience, a necessary donation to keep my brother's latest disaster from sinking us all. He didn't deny the forgery. He justified it as a desperate measure taken by a mother trying to save her son. My father, the retired judge, was telling me that my rights were secondary to Julian's reputation. He looked at me not as a victim of a crime, but as a threat to the family's carefully curated peace. He asked me to be reasonable, to let the mortgage stand, and promised that he would talk to Mom tomorrow, the same empty promise that had been the soundtrack to my erasure for decades. This was the moment the last load-bearing wall of my loyalty finally gave way. The man who had spent his life upholding the law was asking me to facilitate a fraud. I realized then that I wasn't just losing my inheritance, I was losing the father I thought I knew. I reached down, picked up the folder, and walked out without another word. He didn't follow me. He didn't call my name. He just picked up his glass and retreated back into the shadows of the Sterling legacy, leaving me to realize that in this house, the only person who was going to fight for Elena Sterling was me. I remained in the house after leaving my father's study, moving through the shadows like a ghost in my own home. I was heading toward the sunroom for a glass of water when I heard the low, rhythmic murmur of my mother's voice. She was talking to Julian. I stopped, my hand resting on the cold marble of the wainscoting, as Victoria's words drifted through the cracked door with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "She'll settle down, Julian," she said, her tone light and dismissive. "Elena has spent her entire life starving for a scrap of my affection. She isn't going to throw away the chance to finally be included just because I handled a few documents for the family's sake." Then Julian asked what would happen if I actually fought back, and my mother let out a sharp, brittle laugh that echoed with a terrifying lack of empathy. "She won't. She's our milking cow, Julian," she said, using a term that made my stomach turn. "She provides the labor, and we provide the prestige. To be honest, I've spent years wishing I hadn't had her at all, simply so I wouldn't have to navigate the inconvenience of sharing your grandmother's inheritance with someone so difficult." This was the coup hitch kui kung, the final push that collapsed every remaining hope I had nurtured for 30 years. I stood there in the dark hallway, finally understanding that I was never a daughter to her. I was merely proof of her success and a resource to be exploited. The hollow space in my chest didn't throb with pain. It went absolutely still, like the silence in an ER right before a code when the noise stops and everything becomes clear. The leash of loyalty and keeping the peace finally snapped. My mother had just given me the ultimate gift. She had confirmed that the version of her I was trying to love never existed. I didn't need to hear another word. I turned away, the architecture of my own cage finally visible in the light, and I knew exactly what I had to do at the gala. The night of the gala arrived like a court date I had set for myself, a final reckoning under the glittering chandeliers of the Sterling estate. Victoria stood at the podium, her voice like silk as she praised Julian's visionary leadership on a project that was, in reality, my stolen labor. When she gestured for me to join them on stage to blow out the candles for my 32nd birthday, she expected the same obedient girl who had always stayed in the shadows. I stepped into the light, the spotlight warm, and the podium solid under my hands. Feeling the weight of the digital evidence I had prepared, I reached out and took the microphone from her hand, a gesture so calm it looked like a daughter's gratitude, until I began to speak. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice projecting through the speakers without a tremor, steady from years of presenting structural truths to boards that ignored me. I looked out at the guests, the Hendersons and the Porters, the important people she valued more than her own blood, and I clicked the remote in my pocket. The large projector screen, intended for a slideshow of Julian's manufactured successes, flickered to life. But it wasn't photos. It was the side-by-side comparison of my grandmother Lillian's real will and the fraudulent mortgage document bearing Victoria's forgery. The gasps moved through the ballroom like a physical wave as the elite realized the Sterling legacy was built on theft. Victoria's ceramic smile hardened into a mask of terror, her hand gripping her champagne flute until her knuckles went white. I told the room what I had heard, that I was nothing but a milking cow, a resource to be harvested. You told 30 people you never loved me, I stated, staring at her as the architecture of her lies collapsed. I didn't slam the mic. I placed it gently on the stand, the way you put down a tool when the job is finished, and walked out into the Charleston night, finally free. Stepping off that stage wasn't a retreat, it was the clinical execution of a pre-planned strategy. Marcus Thorne was waiting in the shadows of the foyer, his expression as focused as it was in a courtroom, holding the leather folio that contained my true birthday gift, legal autonomy. I didn't just leave my mother with a bruised reputation, I left her with a choice. Through Marcus, I delivered the literal invoice for the $500,000 she had stolen through forgery. The terms were non-negotiable. She had exactly 24 hours to initiate the return of the funds to my grandmother's estate, or the file complete with the forensic handwriting analysis, and the evidence of her public confession would be handed directly to Onassis, the Charleston District Attorney, to face criminal charges for forgery and mortgage fraud. This was the legal solution that finally turned the tide. I wasn't just making a scene, I was finishing a job. I had already notified the mortgage lender that the title was under dispute, effectively freezing the loan and preventing Victoria from liquidating any more of my heritage to cover Julian's incompetence. By the time the first guests were calling for their valets, my bank accounts were moved, my passwords were changed, and the milking cow had officially left the barn. I had spent years verifying every structural detail for the Sterlings. Tonight, I verified the total destruction of their leverage over me. As I handed the final document to Marcus to be couriered to my father's study, I felt the enormous pressure to sacrifice my life for theirs finally evaporate. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a tomorrow that never came. I had prepared for this with the same precision I used for my blueprints. No signature meant no marriage to their lies, and no compromise meant no more disappearing. I didn't need a mother's love to be whole. I needed the truth, documented and filed, to be free. Stepping into the humid night, I wasn't just the invisible Sterling daughter. I was a woman who had finally seized the mic and her own destiny.